Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Fireside Chat with Parth and Aritra. We have two wonderful researchers and practitioners in mental health, decolonization, and trauma informed therapy. And today's conversation is going to be around rage, resistance, and recovery. I would like Parth and Aritra to say like a few lines about themselves and their area of interest before we dive into the conversation. Um, as you all know, this is a virtual chat. So if anybody has a question, please raise your hand. I'll be happy to direct the camera towards you and you can have a conversation with Parth and Aritra. Who wants to start?
Maybe
Aritra,
you
why
can
don't you go?
nominate someone.
I was nominating Aritra. I was like, why don't you start?
Okay, so briefly about me, I think I'll try to not, like go with the very formal aspect of what I do, but just sort of outlining at the first that I really like cats and tattoos. I wanted to mention this because often we talk about mental health in a very sort of, watertight disciplinarian kind of manner. Um, Now, moving outside that, I'm also a therapist. I work across the range of mental health issues, and my particular interests are around, queer trans mental health and also critiquing dominant discourses and seeing what are some of the loopholes and cracks in them and how can we find alternatives. So that's basically about me. I'll let Parth take over.
Thanks, Aritra. I think I got to start by saying I love tattoos as well. I design my own. So, yeah, we got that in common more now. So that's fun. Hi, everyone. My name is Parth. My pronouns are he, they. I'm an abolitionist anti-colonial scholar. I work within the larger global mental health framework, but primarily draw in from my own lived experience of being a queer, non-binary, disabled mad person. And also my work within the research is focused a lot on health equity. I work from a like again, other than just the formal part, I'm also a multimedia artist and filmmaker. So I draw from a lot of those different ways to understand knowledge production and the way that we think about life. So excited to be here.
Thank you so much, Parth and Aritra. Now that we're all familiar with what kind of work they do, I would like to start off our conversation on rage, resistance, and recovery. Something that I think would set the tone for the rest of the afternoon is by starting off with what mental health is and what politics has to do with mental health. So, in a simpler question, I want to ask, is mental health really political at all? And if it is, can you elaborate how it is and why we should care?
This is rage bait.
Parth, would you like to start?
I think yeah, I can start. Ooh, I was just like, okay, this triggered every part of my body. But no, I think the way that we like our perceptions of mental health have been borrowed from a largely Eurocentric, ableist, cisgender, like heterosexual understanding, which means that people who are predominantly white, upper class, and even within the larger like South Asian context, are light-skinned, upper caste people have dominated the understanding of mental health, which is why I think it's reduced to the commodity of what you're also referring to as something which can be bought and sold, which we can give to other people and receive, and it's all apoliticized. I think that's not true. Mental health is a systemic outcome of the distress that we're all going through and is impacted by our social cultural realities, which is why I think it's very important to say, even saying that it's not political comes from a space of, okay, who decides the politics of mental health? Specifically in the larger mental health industrial complex, which is formed by the rampant militarization, incarceration of people, by the politics of erasure, by genocide, war, manufactured poverty, so on and so forth. So it is political at the baseline. It's just that the vantage point of who is defining the politics tend to differ from person to person. What about you, Arita?
So I like to resonate with what Parth said and also add that often what happens in mental health discourses, and this is largely coming from the times, when I was a student myself, within classrooms and training realities, and later when I also sort of shifted out to practice and work. I would say that mental health in the curriculum is depoliticized, which means that it is taught in a way where, you would just be learning symptoms of disorders and therapies to tend to them without really engaging with the world at large. Right. So, for instance, even the kind of interventions that we offer, like self-care packages, for instance, we often, very randomly say that you can go for a spa or, like go for a walk in the park. But there are many people who do not have access to parks, with the increasing loss of third spaces in neighborhoods. There are people who cannot afford a spa. So the fact that we do not take care of the social locations of clients whenever we are offering interventions, and we try to make it a one size fit all kind of thing, that's more our doing than the world at large, right? And also, for instance, given what is happening in Gaza, say, given what has happened in Iran, how are you going to sort of offer comfort and, speak words of affirmation to people who have been ravaged by these circumstances and through, geopolitics? Right. So there, I think, becomes the question of essentially having to address the system and not overlooking it, because I feel the latter is then an act of violence, given what is happening across the globe.
It brings me to this one thing I heard about how we used to say, go see a therapist. This is something you need to talk with your therapist. But after a point, we realize that being able to see a therapist is a point of privilege, right? So I'm leaning towards mental health, access to mental health facilities, also good mental health or mental well-being becoming a privilege in today's time and socio-political scenario. But Arisa's goal also and the conference is about making these things accessible, right? So, as practitioners as people on the field, what do you think is the best way to make mental health accessible without it coming off as an alien concept to, say, the underprivileged and not something that is no, out of reach for them?
Mhm. Parth, would you like to
Thinking,
go or
thinking.
would you like me to take up?
You can start and then I think I can follow. Yeah, I'm thinking.
Yes. So one thing that I feel, and this is something that comes right at the top of my mind, is funding in itself, right? Because a lot of interventions cannot materialize because of lack of funding. And I think to ask these questions within a developing country like India in itself essentially centers issues of funding, because we do not have funds. Look at our mental health budget, for instance. And then when you're seeing people, the majority of the people in our nation, they're not accessing mental health on these therapy platforms or private chambers. They're accessing mental health in OPDs of government hospitals, where the doctors hardly have 10 minutes of time per patient, right? So there, to sort of even do therapy in a proper process, you cannot, right? So I think, therefore, you have to really sort of be very time efficient. That even if you were to suggest interventions, that's something that you need to pre-think. That what am I going to suggest, and make optimum use of that time so that you can give the person succinct takeaways to, work on. That's one thing. I also feel that there's a larger need of community-centered interventions rather than very individualistic form of care, which I think we have grown too comfortable with, like mostly, like the doctor-patient kind of model. But I think group work, group interventions are very good modalities of bypassing these challenges. And once again, I would link that to questions of funding as well. And I think if we can raise these questions globally, and if we can pull funding for, around similar lines, I think it becomes easier to then reach more. I wouldn't say that the problem gets solved, because the problem is a hell lot, but at least you can start working around it and, kind of offer some sort of scaffolding so to speak?
I think for me, I think it also asks a larger question of what do we consider well-being to be, right? Is it only access to primary care facilities within PHCs, or say that okay, psychiatric or OPD support with one-to-one, which also what Aritra was talking about? Is it tertiary care support, which is again very very localized to certain demographics where people, the everyday person that you conceptualize, does not have access to that, right? So what does mental health access even look like? To me, I would think I would stretch that and go, our tunnel vision for mental health remains on the commodity that we can provide and buy in, right? That's about it. But what happens to housing? What happens to rights? What happens to holding the state accountable? A lot of the times, non for profits, even well meaning non for profits, end up acting as a proxy for social impact because you're filling in the gaps that the state has created very, very strategically by underfunding some things, right? So when we're not holding the state accountable, non-for-profits have to come in and now take over that role and say, we can only do what we can within the parameters that we are in. Specifically, if it's foreign funding, then even more. You're limited by, again, regulations on what can be funded, what can't be. So then mental health automatically becomes a very apoliticized entity that we provide. Take the context of what's happening in the Northeast or what's happening in Kashmir for that matter. When you have relentless internet shutdowns, what can a digital mental health intervention be that you can provide within that space? It's just not possible. What happens to the migrant worker who's in a city for 3 months, who's working on daily wage when they want to go and access a mental health care institution, but the government mental health care institution has a 6 hour waiting line? They're effectively losing on their daily wage to go and access and stand in line for a psychiatrist to do a 6.5 minute consultation and say, here's the pill package that you hop on, go back, but your material conditions of being a migrant worker in India don't change. So it's to say that, okay, our mental health work is also defined a lot by class in the way that, yes, we're thinking of interventions from a particular lens. Also, to what Aritra said, mental health is not only about therapeutic spaces, right? What happens to art? What happens to community-centered interventions? What happens to play within these spaces? A lot of communities in India already have relational well-being integrated within their systems. It's just that that's not considered like explicitly mental health, so we're not platforming it as such. So I think we need to increase that discourse a little bit of what qualifies as good well-being or mental well-being also.
That's a very interesting point, and it's bringing me back to a research paper I read about how people, at least in India, tend to look at mental health resources or resource person as like the last resort, even if we're talking about say middle class families and individuals. Seeing a therapist is probably something that's last on their list. They'd probably first go to a physician, then maybe a baba or some guru, faith healer, and then like I think that would be when they've run out of all options. I think therapy is something that's suggested that comes through a doctor, or it's a very new idea to introduce to them. So I'm wondering, how do we shift? I agree funding needs to be shifted towards like making mental health more decolonized, but I'm also wondering, how do we shift the people towards seeking out resources like this?
Can we ask questions?
Yeah, for sure.
I'm feeling excluded from the camera just between the three of your.
Which is why we set up the camera.
Yeah, can you put it in front so they can also see who the
It's connected to the HDMI. That's why it's sort of repeating.
Okay.
But is this okay? Can you guys see them? Okay. You can answer my question, and then maybe we can move on to that. You can still ask because they won't be able to.
Yeah, we can club
let
those.
Tanvi know
Yeah.
the question and she'll. Yes, but you can pop off.
I'll add and then I'll ask Aritra to, I think, come in. I think it's not about shifting the people to psychiatric services because, again, what is the psychiatric service providing, right? It's also pathologizing general responses to distress. Now, if someone is going through poverty, someone is going through the climate crisis, someone is going through unemployment or genocide or occupation, you can't tell them to move towards mental health services which are individualistic and say, here is a 1 hour package once a week that you can take with the 6 session thing with the therapist, right? That comes from a very specific, like, again, class that can access that. And also the larger picture in India is who is the middle class in India? The wage disparity between the people who have the resources to attain these services and the everyday people that are the majority is very, very stark. So when we're also asking people to let go, we are creating a binary between psychiatric services and individual holistic cultural services. There are many programs in the Southeast of Asia and also parts of Northern Africa where they've started integrating cultural healing practices with mental health practices. So it's to say that, okay, you don't have to pick and choose between your culture and then the Western influence of psychiatry, but we can go hand in hand based on the need that is there. But both of them also recognize that we don't need to promote an individualistic culture of everyone needs to go to therapy, because that's simply not true. Therapy is the last resort for a lot of people. Why is that so? What are the systems that are failing to a point where psychiatry, which pathologizes your general day-to-day distress, is the last option as well, right? Yeah, I think I would add that. Aritra, what do you think?
So, one thing that I would also like to highlight is the framework of care, right? I think Parth was briefly highlighting about that. So, say I verbalize my distress within a clinical setting, and then I am handed a pill. Now, this pill is, I'm taking this pill, and there's some improvement in functioning, but then the distress around me is not sort of going away. So the sense of being held really is absent. And I'm also aware that unlike psychiatry, if you're talking about therapy, it's a long-term process as well. So which means that there are more sessions to take and more money involved as well, right? Now, what I also think when you ask about how can we then, take people who are needing therapy to therapy, because I think there's also a stigma regarding seeking help, right? And this stigma is around how mental health is viewed in society, how mental illness is viewed in society, what are the idioms of distress, even superstitions, myths around. Because unlike physical health, where you can show, okay, I'm running a temperature and therefore I have a fever, in mental health discourse, there's a lot of behavioral changes that you see, right? And therefore, a lot of mental health symptoms, like, for instance, lack of motivation, may be interpreted as laziness within the culture, and then that stigma for the person to bear. For instance, if there are dissociative symptoms, right? Often say within very abusive contexts, there are, for instance, elements of possession, right? Like a religious deity is possessing the person. And so there is published literature around how when the person is so-called possessed, those are probably the only times when they are also revered and treated as a person. Otherwise, they're in really violent context. So the dissociative symptoms, so to speak, are also a response to that distress, because there is some amount of validation in that role. Now, do you exactly treat those symptoms and take away that agency from the person in the little bit that they experience, or do you let that stay and instead increase social support? So these also become challenges to look at, right? Just to ending on a quick note, I feel it is good if we can find ways in which we can take therapy to the people, rather than thinking of the other way around. And a good way to do that, I think, are public health interventions. For instance, organizing mental health camps in rural areas where, you use really jargon-free, simple language for people to come and talk about their issues. And, just like use cultural elements, tools of life. For instance, I was working within a peer support framework where, form of community building was drawing mehendi on each other's hands as a intervention of building solidarity. And so that became a process of joy and collective handholding as well. So I think we need to find these cultural metaphors and idioms within our work, because most of our work and the frameworks they come from are very, very divorced from the cultural realities over here.
Just to add,
yeah.
Just to add, I think one more example to that would be, it's also like, what is the purpose of this mental health, right? Like community intervention, like the friendship bench have existed for a very long period of time, where grandmothers are quite literally the lay counselor, so-called, whatever the lay here means, are providing psychosocial support to the community members on quite literally a bench on which they sit and talk. which is the whole basis for the task sharing approach, which also has its own problems within the context of India, where community health workers and frontline workers are going within their communities and providing behavioral activation, doing assessments to ensure that anyone who requires severe support is also then redirected or socially prescribed to the appropriate help. I think it's also a question on, what does the mental health solution here be? Is it to then be like a band-aid on the larger systemic gaps, or is it to provide support to those who are disenfranchised beyond compare? Now, again, our understanding of mental health is also people who can leave the system, right? Which is people who enter and then exit. It's like a revolving door phenomena of recidivism, which is very similar to a prison. Who can exit and enter the mental health system is a very small population. We don't talk about the people that are currently incarcerated within institutions, psychiatric institutions across the country. Even in Pune, you already have one of the largest asylums of India, which currently has active beds. So I think that example stands true already in terms of, incarceration existing. What about people who are there? What about their human rights? Are we then talking about good mental health being keeping them in mind as well? Or is it only a one-to-one system that we're thinking of?
It's very valid. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, but they won't be able to hear you.
Tanvi
I can hear you.
He can hear you. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, great. Okay. So this is more a thought formation question commentary thing. So I was also thinking about the concept of decolonization in and of itself, because as a country, we haven't particularly decolonized. Like even the history making process, the nationalism process that we've had has been also very caste-based. It's also a lot of the ideals of modernity that the British imperialism system has left for us. So I'm just curious, in your work, how do you find fragments or pockets of decolonization from within the communities that you work with? And what are ways to share them across networks of other people who are doing similar work so that we can have like a robust system of decolonization?
Start. Pass it over. I think my initial response to that would be, one, decolonization has already happened. We just don't like the fact that decolonization has happened from changing the Western colonial power to the dominant caste Savarna replacement of that decolonization. So India's got its independence. We've retained our governance systems. Decolonization as a process has happened. Now, what you're also talking about, and what I also work a lot within, is the abolition of this model, which is the replacement of one oppressive power with the Savarna upper caste men taking over, and then creating the whole Ayurveda push of mental health, which is that only one certain system and language exists. We are changing historical revisionism of Western terms to one that fits in within the Hindutva understanding of mental health as well, right? So what I would also say is that there are abolitionist practices which are already happening. A lot of peer-led models across the country don't subscribe to the NGOization of mental health, which are working within the grassroots, which are providing mutual aid, support, community, housing, healthcare. Now, that is not coded as mental health because it's not explicitly mental health, but those programs have a mental health outcome. When we talk about like research organizations, etc., it's again, you see intellectual decolonization, that yes, we all know the language, but there is some level of cooperation, right? That we are doing decolonial work, but we're still working within the framework. So the question is, can you really decolonize a prison? You can't decolonize a prison system in the same way that you can't reform a cop. So it's to say, are we looking at moving beyond just decolonization to the abolition of these oppressive systems? Can we create community mental health infrastructure, recognizing the need to move towards that? So it's a yes and of yes, this exists and we are part of it and we are complicit in it in some capacity. But are we also then funding, creating mutual aid campaigns within the community, working within that space? And also then, ensuring that indigenous systems, Dalit Bahujan Adivasi systems are strengthened in support and are also centered in terms of the voices. Like people like me should not be having this discourse of decolonization because this is the norm, or in the conversations of mental health, a light-skinned person from mainland India who's a fourth-generation academic. So I don't think I should be like the voice of who's speaking about this particular thing as well. And I think Aritra and I have had very similar conversations in the past. So yeah, I'm eager to hear what she has to say.
I think one thing that even when I was taking the opportunity to speak here, I felt that a part of decolonizing could also be, and I don't know how this would be received, but this is something that I've felt for quite some time, is leaving the stage, right? I think leaving the stage is very important because for many of us who keep talking in different spaces, I think it's important to also reflect on, are we then foregrounding voices that are of different realities than ours? And I would say I'm guilty of that, because as I'm speaking, I also carry my privileges into this room, and I think that I'm very aware of the weight of that, right? And therefore, to also recognize this and not let it slide. I feel very consciously leaving the stage is also a practice where you do invite, Dalit Bahujan Adivasi voices into the spaces to talk about their experiences. And not in the sense that, because often what happens is, whenever knowledge is being produced, there is a sort of hierarchy that you are the subject of observation and I am observing you and making notes. I think those hierarchies also need to be challenged. Even in, very ground realities of what happens in, and I'll say a bit about OPD settings and hospital settings because those are settings I'm more often than not exposed to. So, simple things like what we call bedside manners in medicine. If a person is coming from a rural area, is not dressed, quote unquote, in a very Bhadraloki fashion, right? Like the middle class Bhadralok, then the behavior of the staff towards them is very, very different from how they would respond to someone they consider as from the Bhadralok Samaj, so to speak. And these are issues. I have even, for instance, when I've been at OPDs, I've seen like doctors, very senior doctors, ask their patient from the first encounter that, and this was an old Muslim man who was coming, and the first question is, how long did it take to grow your beard? I've seen this happen right in front of me. And it is something that's, and this person is demonstrating interactions to his batch of trainees. So imagine when this is how people are seeing, this is normalized, right? It is normalized to make casteist comments, Islamophobic comments, and these are all slid under the carpet. So I think it's very important that, yes, I would totally agree that, systems need to be abolished, but when I say that, I would also like to look at how would that look like in daily praxis? How would that look like in daily interactions? What do we do or not do? Right? For instance, when we were taught how to take, and then we all do this. So when we sit with clients, we often take case histories, right? So we were just asked to, fill a marker for caste, that SC/ST, that's it. And you move on, but you don't ask what difficulties does caste produce in your lives then? What opportunities are limited? How have, like, those discussions need to be centered, but that is something that we were not taught in training as well. So I think it's a complex conversation around how we probably need to decolonize and go beyond as well, and how that is a process and not a finite outcome to arrive at.
Absolutely. Just one more addition to that, like in terms of an example, would be something as simple as, what Aritra said in the beginning, also the self-care that we are asked to give people as like, okay, here you go, breathe, ground yourself. Now, when you look at specifically the dynamics within the country, mental health care is dominated by upper caste people who are oblivious of their caste capital and are not keeping an account of the reflexivity of who's coming to this session. If you as an upper caste person are giving a person from the Dalit Bahujan Adivasi community a self-care package of, oh, here you go, ground yourself by the breathing exercise, that's caste violence in practice then and there. Is again the occupation of another person's body in front of you, knowing very well that this is decontextualized in the context of history of caste violence, right? Then and there. So that's like violence within that space. And also in terms of, I with this hair have been mischaracterized as a psychiatric survivor myself multiple times. Of, this doesn't fit the normative lens of what is kept. So every time a status exam was done on me, it's unkempt versus signed on. If it's tattoos, it's understood that you're fitting a personality profile that is already emotionally unstable, or because you're queer and non-binary, you're already a certain kind of patient that is entering. So it's to say, if you add blue hair here, great. I'm the trifecta of now oppression for a psychiatrist or a mental health care profession to sign off on, right? So it's also to say who creates these categories of sickness, who creates these categories, and who has the epistemic hierarchy to enforce them. So now that we are here, yes, abolition is a pathway, right? So there is incremental reform. The same way that all prisons you can't abolish without having alternatives of restorative justice. Similarly, are people even sensitized to queer trans issues, specifically with what's going on in the country right now? Are even physicians aware of what's going on? Are people aware of their caste capital? Are people actively looking at doing anti-oppressive work? Then potentially moving on, okay, yeah, now we can also think of alternatives. But yes, incremental reform in the larger structures is very necessary for decolonization as a process also.
Yes.
Hi, this was really helpful, and it also, I think, a bit of baiting part because we've spoken about these things in the past. But I have two questions really. So one is like on abolition, and Aritra mentioned that, like, thinking about what comes next or what comes along with abolition. And one of the things that I keep coming back to, and I'm really grateful that both of you all mentioned Gaza and Kashmir in this conversation, because you don't get to hear that word a lot at conferences, especially like conferences that are academia adjacent. As someone who is an academic, was an academic, I'm a scientist. It's really frustrating because it feels like, we are supposedly like trained, and I'm a first generation academic. And this, like, I went to it with a lot of like pride and eagerness just to learn that we have to learn to sanitize our language. We have to learn to like speak for other people. And I'm wondering, like, that is a part of mental health. Like, partly like my mental health was awful the last decade is because I didn't feel there was space to speak about things that needed to be spoken about. And I say this as someone who is also class privileged, who also has these privileges in different contexts. So one is like, how do we create spaces, especially like people who are mental health workers or who care about mental health, to have space for these narratives? Because I think often when you don't get a chance to speak, that is not does not mean you need to see a therapist, but you need those spaces publicly, because that narrative is also how subjugation is written. And second, this is a selfish question as someone who is also like writer wanting to like do more educational stuff around like science, health, mental health and writing. Like, what kind of spaces can be created to really like, learn writing in community in a way that is not just like apolitical, or it's not just meant to be like aesthetics, but it is recognizing that art is a tool of propaganda. It is a political tool. And that tool needs to be in the right hands. And by right hands, I mean people who are marginalized, people who don't have the voice. And I mean, I'm not trying to be like, I want to be that person teaching everyone, but I'm trying to understand how do I create that space both for myself and like in spaces where I am. So we're not really like, just being all mushy about art, but also recognizing that it is a responsibility, and the responsibility is also like, how do we respond to the world?
Take a second to think about that long conversation. But I think just early thoughts, and then I'll hand it over to Aritra, is also the fact that we're mentioning these things, right? It's only sanitized till you, like the moment you choose to unsanitize a language and make it move away from that system, it automatically shifts the discourse. One of the reasons why I was so excited to do this with Aritra was because from our early conversations, we've been on projects together since 2024 in some of the other capacity. One of our early conversations was around the sanitization of mental health, of who gets to talk about it, who gets to disseminate, and who gets to create knowledge. So at the moment we talk about realities, and today now not talking about the realities is also problematic in a way that you choosing to be complicit. Like the American Psychological Association and the DSM are some of the most complicit oppressive structures in mental health across the world, specifically with the sixth version that they're now creating, right? Which is the scientific manual, which is now looking at suicide as a disorder as well, as already pathologized grief that people went through after the pandemic. And at the same time, the APA took a very long time after George Floyd in the USA in 2020 to put out a statement and say that we are complicit in racial like discourse and specifically, inequalities in America. They took over 10 months after the Gaza genocide to start to put out a statement. Both sides of, yes, Israel is also suffering as a settler colonial state, as well as the people who are going through a genocide. So I think it becomes a power privileged position of, if you're in the mental health capacity, it's the choice that you make to be political, because you understand as a person that mental health is not apolitical. And therefore, by mentioning these systems, you're recognizing the interconnectedness of oppressive systems as well, right? I think I would start by that. Ritra, what do you think?
I would just, also add to what you were saying in terms of particularly looking at our own positionality as well, and what power we carry into these spaces as professionals, as facilitators. I think it's very important to, while we often are people who are bringing in frameworks into these spaces, I think we have to be very humbly open to stand corrected and unlearn. Because it might so happen that when we are with people from these spaces, their realities can bring up very different frameworks. And do we then honor those frameworks as frameworks worth engaging with? I think that's very important. And I think peer support in particular can be a very, very important way in which such spaces can be created, right? And I think uh, also when you're looking at mental health, then not just to keep those catchphrases as we keep around well-being and self-care and self-esteem and all of that, but to also talk about body, to also talk about violence, to also talk about these systems, because the more you talk about these systems as a whole, maybe misogyny, sexism, racism, casteism, homophobia, transphobia, then you sort of also, automatically open the door for validation of distress that is created by these systems. I think that is very important. So some days ago, I'll just give you an example. And this was not a pleasant experience. So I'll not name sort of organizations, but this was for like a sensitization program, so to speak, that I was doing for an organization. And when they saw videos that I had put out for the organization, now those videos were not very pleasant realities. They were of people facing difficulties in the workplace. And I was told that these are too much to take. And this kind of language is not used right now. And I should give more aspirational examples. Now, if I give more aspirational examples, so to speak, all people soaring high and spreading their wings wide, it will not change these ground realities. And I think that's also, but this conversation really got me thinking as to, what then becomes acceptable within a program, what doesn't become acceptable. And since these are often spaces that are also funding you or facilitating you, do these spaces allow these conversations? And can we push for these spaces to, accommodate these conversations or resist them in ways we can?
Absolutely. Just to extend on what Aritra is talking about, I think to your second question, it also adds on, what is the purpose of the writing exercise that you want to do, or what is the purpose? Is it community building? Then there is a whole other ecosystem of, connecting with other people with lived experience, connecting with mad survivor movements, disability justice movements that are already within this space. If it's also catharsis, that drives a very different understanding of how we're doing this. I would still say, I think, center discomfort, particularly within this work. One thing that I've learned works really well is making people uncomfortable. And discomfort as a way to hope and critical hope to say that, one, all of us need to be uncomfortable with our own positionality first to recognize how we're complicit in models, and then particularly moving into how can we change the systems to do so. So for me also, I think being trained within the clinical setup, being a psychiatric survivor myself, there was a dissonance and a liminence of, okay, where do I place my own harm that I've received from this space? I've had my own identity, rage, resistance pathologized. And then how do I operate not as a cop of the state where I'm now cop in a cardigan sitting in my therapy session trying to do the same thing, even though well-meaning, but doing the same thing to another person. So I think that discomfort starts off with that level of reflexivity yourself, and then you find like-minded people very quickly in terms of, who else is comfortable enough and needs to be shaken up a little, and what systems need to be disrupted. Not a pleasant pathway over the years I've learned, but yeah, a really helpful one.
Thank you. Any questions from the chat? Okay. I have a couple of questions. I want to go back to the your abstract, and a couple of things with respect to rage, because I'm very excited to talk about rage. I think it's not a very well-spoken topic. It's not something that's discussed very well too, but I also want to talk about it in terms of who gets access to express rage and who does not. And I come back to the concept of erasure and what erasure means to individuals accessing, I'm going to say well-being for the lack of a better word, but yeah, I basically mean well-being. And in the context of, say, any sort of discrimination, For a more concrete example, I would like to talk about the Trans Persons Amendment Bill, where a whole section of the community is being excluded. And I'm sure with that kind of a legal exclusion, it comes down to like accessing resources, holding space becomes extremely important, especially if there's no providence for something like for your existence. So I would love to hear your thoughts on it. Like, either of you can start off.
Mitra, do you want to take it?
Yeah, so I would just start off with my, reflections from a workshop I was doing just yesterday. And this was with a medical institute where mostly I was in conversation with mental health professionals. And aside from one or two people, mostly people did not know about the bill at all. Okay. Now, this is important to recognize because then if you are going to hold rage, so to speak, you are not aware of the source of rage only. And one of the comments that also came from within the session was around someone saying, and this was basically a queer trans affirmative mental health training. Okay. So there was this person who said, I feel that I am in the wrong for being heterosexual because a lot of rage seems to be directed at heterosexual people. Now, the thing is, maybe this is something that's coming out of the training as well, because this person is probably being aware of their privilege for the first time. Maybe there is no such discussion around it. And the fact that it is spotlighted is also making them uncomfortable, right? So I think this rage, then where does it travel, right? And this discomfort, who is the a person who's discomforted? I think those are important questions also. So, for instance, when you're trying to impose a diagnostic framework on a person, because often trans persons have to go through diagnostic frameworks to access care. If a person turns around the question and says, can you give me care beyond this diagnosis? Can you facilitate my access to treatments beyond this diagnosis? Do you hold space for that rage? So I think it's very important to sort of look at rage produced by systems not as a symptom to be managed, but as a very, very valid form of response to distress. In fact, protective even, because people who are not raging are also people who have given up hope. And that's even a more despair state, that you have given up hope and you're not raging at all. You're succumbing to the systems. And if I may dare say, maybe also cultivate rage so that stays alive in a way that you can, fight against systems. And over to Parth.
Oh, I love that answer. I believe in cultivating rage any day. I think that is what drives me to exist in spaces like these.
Okay, so I'll just briefly summarize without taking much time. I was also saying how, I was conducting this queer trans affirmative training where there was a person who stood up to comment about how he felt sidelined as a heterosexual person in the course and felt like a lot of rage was directed at him as if he has done something wrong by being heterosexual. Now, I really appreciated the candid nature of this response, but what I'm also then interested to look at is this person probably hasn't reflected on the privileges it's brought so far, so it kind of opened up a Pandora's box for him. And so I asked him to also stay with that discomfort and see where it takes him, because I think that's very important. And another point which I was making was also often when we see rage, particularly within marginalized communities, our immediate impulse, and I would say therapeutic or clinical impulse, is also to make that rage go away. And I think that in itself is also a form of violence. Because it's very important, this is what I was saying, to cultivate that rage, to see how that rage can be protective. Because unless we are doing that, we are again standing in alignment with those very systems that have put them at a point where they are enraged. And we are in fact contributing to that cycle of violence. So just wanted to highlight that before, Parth sort of also takes over to, share your findings, Parth. Yes.
I think cultivating rage, the way that I initially also when you said that, I was just like, oh, thank God, because yes, I believe in that. I think that is what drives me to be here in places like these. People ask me what's the way to stay within the organizing space in India, and I'm like, just rage is what pure rage is what keeps me here. I think, and also let's do like a historicization of rage also, within the mental health context. When we go back to early editions of who was being pathologized, there was again the condition of drapetomania was within 1853 within the United States of America, where Samuel Cartwright was a medical physician who created a diagnosis for the runaway slave. For an enslaved black person to run away from their master was understood as a pathology, because why would a slave want a better life? The French colonists could never think of the fact that the Haitian people conducted a revolution against them, because why would anyone want the French to go away? Doesn't say much about the French. At the same time, the Dutch colonial psychiatrists kept hypothesizing running amok, which is a Malay term to say that the Malay people that they were colonizing were going crazy, because why would anyone get angry against the Dutch? The cute little Dutch people. Why would anyone be angry at being colonized by them? In India, also, the British Asylums Act came in after the Indian so called revolution at that particular point within the South Asian context, where they took any four meandering people on the street and put them within this asylums because, well, people were enraged on being colonized by the British for so long. So let's contextualize that fact in the history. Now let's contextualize that in the present systems as well. Schizophrenia is a racial diagnosis predominantly for Black men who are aggressive, born out of the segregation within America where the races were segregated. So where Black men were lynched for even looking at a white woman. So imagine if while looking at a white woman, you can get lynched, your aggression and anger is already hypothesized as something which is, problematic and pathologized. In the same way, we know for a fact how women have been disproportionately targeted for their rage in the form of hysteria and reduced to their reproductive ability and action, because why would a woman's autonomy have nothing to do with just their menstruation, right? That's what mental health is hypothesized for the longest time. You now look at those particular frameworks, the students who've been protesting across the countries for Gaza, for Palestine, for these things have been relentlessly policed as people who are going crazy, because why would you want to risk your future when you're putting up an encampment in a university, which is the Ivy League? In the same way, within India and other spaces, you look at rage being pathologized all the time. So let's contextualize this. One of my favorite quotes on rage is by Bell Hooks, who says that the rage of the oppressor is never the same as the rage of the oppressed. Those two things are measured and understood very, very differently. Who thinks of rage? Whose rage is allowed to exist? And how do we then internalize our rage a lot when we have no output within that space, right? So it's always very interesting to me to say that, okay, how do we cultivate and honor rage? I think it also comes from the fact that to exist, a lot of us are resisting. So the whole idea of existence is resistance comes from the fact that we're enraged enough to stay in the system that continues to diminish us and erase us. So it's necessary that we do that. With the Trans Amendment Bill also, it's not only that people don't understand the complications of this particular process, but they think of the fact that it's a purely trans issue, that's a purely gender-based issue. That's not true. Gender affirming care is not only accessed by trans people, but yes, that's a stereotype that is focused here. It is also accessed by cis women who are going through menopause when they require hormonal therapy. It's also accessed by men across their lifespans when they require gender affirming care for erectile dysfunction, for their to look more masculine, to behave in whatever their understanding of masculinity is. So right now, it is our rights which have been erased very conveniently. Tomorrow, reproductive autonomy will be taken away from women, which has already been taken away from women in the United States of America, which was a pioneer for anti-trans legislations across the world. And that repercussion and the ripple effect is something that we're already seeing. So when self-determination is taken away, it's not only our rights that are gone now. We have known the DSM has pathologized us. The British had the Criminal Tribes Act, which pathologized the trans people during the colonial time. Our rights didn't exist per se in legislation up until very recently. So it's no surprise to us that we have technically lost them. It's to say that what stops the state from surveilling your body? This is a necropolitical paradigm on whose body can be weaponized by the state, who is disposable enough. And when more people understand that, it quickly becomes I don't think I just need to be queer, trans, affirmative. I need to actually understand the systems that are in place that are actively looking at us as weapons for electoral politics, right? And then you move beyond that understanding and say, what can I do to resist?
We had a question asking, what can we do to resist?
Quite a lot. I would go back and say that, where do you feel the hurdle in participating? Because you're already in a space where we're talking about these things. So access is present, language is present. What's the hurdle in terms of participation? That is what I would ask in terms of organizing.
If I'm talking in terms of organizing, even for the unconference, for us, it has always come from the place that we may not know best and we do not want to overstep. So, as much as we want to involve people from marginalized communities, give them opportunities, and make accommodations to make this as accessible and inclusive, um, there is also this concern, like we are very aware of our privilege and the fact that we are from like very secluded bubbles of just echo chambers, and it is a little difficult to navigate. It is a little difficult to make intention very clear in terms of, hey, we just want to give you a platform to speak, and it's not just a token gesture, right? So it is a little difficult to navigate that aspect of things, but it's also a little difficult to account for the support we'll get to say resist or even rebel and provide platforms to these kind of people. And I think it comes back to what Aritra said about like funding, and a lot of people are withholding money, are not open to fund projects that would sort of challenge their status quo. So yeah, I think that's the problem we are facing, and we would really, really appreciate any sort of guidance you can offer us, because we do want to make this accessible, but we also don't want to come off as these very snooty people who are just like above you and trying to help you. I think that's
Come off as that.
not
I
the
think
route
that's
at all.
fine. I think that's fine. I think this safety, I think the risk averse nature of organizations today and communities are withholding participation from communities by saying optics matter more than impact. To say that, this is a lot, this is a discussion that comes in. I was taking a class for the Hansraj students today early in the morning on the USCP course. And again, people were saying that I don't want to because I don't want to overstep. No, overstep. It's bound to happen. We didn't learn this by the nature of being people from the communities by doing this kind of work. It is only like during the protests right now in Delhi, by attending those spaces, have understood the heterogeneity within the trans identities from the Northeast that I had no idea about because of Northeastern advocates who are here protesting, right? So my understanding itself is also evolving in the same way that most QACP practitioners don't know how to work with aero-AS identities, understand polyamory, understand polygamous identities, understand kink affirmation spaces. Now, these are things which get very hush-hush because, okay, I don't know enough and I won't speak. And I think that resists us from making a mistake. Make the mistake. I would say optics don't matter more than impact, I think. And also, one thing would be, we want to do well by getting people on board. And I think it's also the decision making, right? People need to be in the deciding room of, okay, who sets the agenda, who talks about these things. And a lot of solutions exist out of funding. There's a fantastic set of essays from the early 2000s called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded by Insight, which talks about the NGOization of liberatory movements by, you pick and choose movements which are palatable and then do them, which is what a lot of the organizations right now in the country are also doing. But then with foreign funding comes the FCRA in India, which is the regulation which determines what can be funded, what can't be funded. The FCRA prohibits anything remotely political. What is political? I was asked this by a Western funder for mental health when I was on a program. Part of the work that you're describing is mental health activism and not mental health advocacy. When I asked the difference, they couldn't tell me that. The difference was because we are a bunch of people talking about our identities in India. So it automatically becomes politicized for a white person sitting in the West. So they were reluctant to fund. So I would say no, make the mistake, get people and learn from that rather than an exclusionary space which then is trying to stay protected. Because I think that runs the risk of then remaining exclusionary for a long period of time and perpetuating the inequities that you're wanting to push away. But yeah, Aritra, what do you think? There's my soapbox on that matter.
So, one thing I'll go back to, I think, what I was saying about the humility to stand corrected. I think often we want to come from an all-knowing and all-informed position. And I think that desire in itself, if you were to look at it critically, is an illusion because there cannot be a point when you are informed in the utmost capacity to intervene. So I think to look at it also as then a dynamic evolving process between you and your participants or co-producers of knowledge, where there is scope to make mistakes and where you come with a stance of not knowing, the fact that you may not know and you're willing to learn, accommodate, and even, like at times face shutdowns maybe to take a step back and process that, right? I also feel that in general, when we are thinking of how can we resist in the everyday, I am particularly looking at joy as a very militant process of resistance, especially when, and I think I did one listening circle with Arisa as well on, queer joy. Why I did that? Because in these times, joy is something that gets shut out of the window very fast. And people don't expect marginalized communities to be joyous, to be dancing, to be singing, to be celebrating. So I think even if you can create those spaces where people can just come, be, maybe there's a DJ who's playing and people are dancing. Maybe that is joy in that moment. That is mental health work. But then, like our lenses are also often restricted by the paradigms that we have been dominantly exposed to. I would also sort of add there are frameworks, for instance, even art based frameworks like Theater of the Oppressed. If you look at that kind of framework, that's a very, very potent framework for engaging communities and even engaging them to look at how, if they're facing oppression, what are they doing? And there are roles and scripts. So when you're working with the community knowledge also comes out that one person who's enacting the oppression is from the community. They know what is the kind of violence. And then another person is also strategizing. So as a whole, you see a whole new narrative come up. And I have been a part of such workshops myself. And I can tell you, it will revolutionize your way of thinking if you also organize or participate in whichever capacity. So I think these could be some of the frameworks that come at the top of my mind that you can engage with as well.
Thank you so much. Does that answer your question? Okay, amazing. I think we have time for one more question, if anybody has one. You have given us a lot to think about. I'm not gonna lie. I mean, there are a lot of ideas, and I think it's settling in a little bit. But any other questions, anyone? Yeah, yeah, of course.
So I was curious. I mean, there's so much to think about here, and I keep going back to something with academic spaces and the kind of questions that are being researched, and something Parth mentioned about the rage of the oppressor versus the rage of the oppressed. And this conversation also has been coming up like APA and DSM, and also the role of I mean, Guantanamo Bay, like the torture tactics were developed in consultation with like scientists and psychologists. And APA took like a decade to respond to that. And so like what can we, I mean, this is more so like, wanting to know your thoughts from being in the field. But I think like how do we also like push conversations within like academic spaces where these things are researched, and there is, despite like, being aware of the limitations of science and academia, there is an inherent like authority that's attached when you're in that system, whether you're from a marginalized community or a privileged person. When you do anything, and you mentioned that you're an academic, there is like this legitimacy that confers. And I think we need to like challenge that. We need to challenge what questions we are answering. We need to like challenge. One of the reasons like I left academia is like, a lot of like trauma research happens with war veterans, and then we have to assume that that's like the kind of trauma that manifests across most of the world. And that's not even true of like within United States, let alone elsewhere. But to even like bring up these questions is hard because going back to funding, a lot of funding comes from the Department of Defense, or US government right now is like just a Department of Defense. So like how do we, I mean, I know that we have all these conversations in such spaces and different rooms and different communities, and I'm very grateful that I have met so many people over the last several years that I can talk about these things without being like asked to leave the room. But I need us to have these conversations in rooms where we will be asked to leave the room. And I think at some point they will have to realize that they would have to have nobody in the room if this is. But I mean, I'm just like, wanting to get your sense on that. Now also like this being a conference with
Loaded.
academics.
Yeah, that's a loaded question. I would just say, I think one example, and then I'll give it to Aritra to, think of it, is that to me, I think, yeah, abolition is not going to be found in academia. We're all aware of the fact that it's a very exclusionary space. The people who are academics, yes, that includes a lot of us who hold multiple marginalized identities, but we are the minority within this space. It is predominantly led by people who generationally have privilege, have epistemic authority, and have been defining science, a very narrow colonial understanding of science. So yes, incremental reform is possible. The co-design part, like the participatory methods in co-design, co-production, in whatever it looks like within mental health, is a response to that. To say that people who are the most impacted, now this goes back to disability justice principles, that interdependence, collective liberation, impact leadership of the most impacted is moving into co-production. But there's also a level of participatory assimilation. No, you get people with three fixed agendas and then minority identities to contextualize that agenda. It doesn't change the fact that the agenda is still being funded at a university which resides in an institution which is again a response for colonial space. Now look at India for that matter. Significant portion of funding in the Mental Health Care Act goes to tertiary care institutes, one of them being NIMHANS. NIMHANS itself used to be a colonial asylum for the longest time. And now NIMHANS is the epicenter of a significant amount of mental health care research and also the epistemic authority of what is defined, being a tertiary care institute itself. You can still add people to do incremental reform within an institute like NIMHANS, but you can't but what does that achieve, in the longer run? I would say like what we've learned from the BDS movement also is the boycott of these spaces when you're looking at their complicity in oppression. Why do universities have dealings with arms productions? Why do academics have, personal lobbying? For that matter, DSM-5 TR had four different categories amongst multiple where pharmaceutical reps had made undisclosed payments to the entire task force. So these are scientifics and academics, 100% on ADHD, 89% on sleep, 100% on sleep-wake disorders, and 89% on neurocognitive disorders, which meant that 100% of the people deciding what the categories for ADHD need to be were paid up to $2.7 million by pharmaceutical companies to go on yachts and give speeches. If that is not a conflict of interest to begin with, how do you reform something like that? You can't. Just to say that these are the people, like you said, who are forming these categories of sickness because there is an influence, an undue influence from other pharmacological industries, which is why the entire industrial complex, I think, exists. For me, I would say abolition is not within academia, though we all find communication within it. So how do we move away from that? In the long term, how do we divest from academia being the only way that we understand knowledge systems? Or zine needs to be higher on the epistemic authority than an academic research paper at a Scopus Index journal. But that's not the case. How many people would you see citing a zine? Citation practice doesn't exist for that until it's published in some place, right? But zines hold far more value in cultural identity within communities than an academic paper could ever translate to. Yeah, with that, I would pass it on to Aritra. Aritra, what do you think?
I was in fact thinking of ways in which we could disrupt these practices in themselves, right? So when we are producing research ourselves, are we thinking about these points already? And then are we using that to inform praxis? For instance, are we then citing zines in our research? Are we then citing community produced knowledge in our research? Because when we center that, that also becomes praxis, even if one person is doing it, right? I think we have to, as a whole, decenter the idea of academia and the hierarchical way it exists, right? In this epistemic sort of glass house, if I may say so, where there are journals and Scopus Index publications and theses and only people with certain credentials producing knowledge. But the larger question I think here also is the fact that the people doing it, once again, the burden keeps falling on people who are facing marginalization themselves. So because they are often the ones who are discontent with the system, and therefore they are invested in abolishing the systems as well. I think that responsibility needs to be redistributed as well. It cannot be that a person is at the receiving end of injustice from a system, then they fight the system, and they also produce research that, is looking at an abolition focus, because then it becomes
called out maximum.
Because then it becomes the sole person's responsibility in different institutions existing in silos. And I think that is, in fact, a manufactured recipe for burnout, because by doing that, you're also silencing voices. You're actually not taking the onus collectively. You know that after a point, these people will tire out. They will fall out of the system, and you will continue as you were. I think that needs to change as well. Right. And I'm sad to say that that is not happening. In fact, I just wanted to make a quick note on this rise of a new discipline. And I wanted to talk about this a bit, Indian psychology. Now, Indian psychology, if you look at the kind of knowledge that's being produced under it, it's mostly how we need to go back to the Vedas and how, Krishna, what he said to Arjun is an example of CBT. And you all are laughing, but then it is being taught in the institutions as our heritage. And without looking at the caste class connotations of such discourses, without looking at the Brahminical supremacy within which this knowledge operates. And we are headed towards very dark times because this is state sponsored. And we see how knowledge production in itself, there was, and since you mentioned, the Institute of Pinnacle Importance part, I would also share how some time ago I saw that, and it would not be long before, we would say hugging cows is a form of therapy as well. Or we are not very far away from there, and that will in fact have a lot of clout. So I think we need to really sort of reflect on what kind of research we are producing and what it is doing to the field and how we are complicit in producing these systems as well.
I scrapped my answer. I think, yeah, word to word what Aritra said. And I think just one more addition to that would be like revolutionaries have existed within the academic system. Paulo Freire was there, bell hooks, you look at Angela Davis, multiple Indian revolutionaries have also been within like the statements of being in academia and also being people with higher academic degrees, if you look at Ambedkar and so on and so forth. So it's not to say that there is no place for that. I think the pedagogy of the oppressed of Paulo Freire is a very good example of how revolutionary praxis can be integrated within academia. How theater of oppressed comes from that legacy of the pedagogy of the oppressed. So it's like there is space for that, but that's not the only thing that should exist, that I would say.
That's thank you for that answer. I mean, I agree with you, like there's space for that in academia, but depending on who you ask, they might say Angela Davis has been
Yeah, obviously. I mean, she started off with supporting, the Black Panthers Party and so on and so forth, and then endorsing Kamala Harris. So it's to say that, pedestalization of any revolutionary is very difficult.
Right. But I mean, I'm really grateful for this answer because I also think that a lot of us need to be thinking this because what Aritra mentioned and what I have realized that when you start becoming more and more ungovernable, you also become unemployable, and not all of us have the privilege to be unemployable, which I am right now. And so I think a lot of us need to like redistribute the risks we're taking so that it doesn't fall on the same people. And I know that there are people who are taking even more risks in other spaces. So yeah, I think just like these conversations are at least important to push that.
Very well summarized, because I think that is very true, and it brings me back to how Parth signs off their email in solidarity, because it stuck with me, and I think throughout this conversation that is also something I've been thinking about, and I want to support people who do not have a voice or do not have a platform to voice their opinions, but also support them not just by putting the onus on them, but also easing the burden in any way possible. And I think the conversation we've had today has been really, really enlightening in that way, because it does help coming from people who have worked in extensively in this area to tell us and lead the rest in a direction that I think would hopefully stop India from heading in the direction the US has. And I still hope that there is something we can do right now to better the situation of the marginalized communities in India. And with that, I will have to close the session. I think we're all very interested to go on for longer, but then I would just be playing into the delaying of the schedule that we faced the consequence of at the beginning of our session today. So thank you so much for both of you, for staying on and talking to us and expressing your opinions so openly and not holding back. Thank you for showing us what privilege looks like and how we can use privilege for the benefit of uh, overall good or everybody's good. And it was lovely talking to you both. And I think if the audience have any questions or they would like to interact with you, is it all right if I pass over your social media handles or emails, and maybe they can reach out to you? Yeah. please reach out to me if you want to get in touch with them, and I'll send their contacts to you. But thanks, Parth. Thanks, Aritra, again for joining. And I hope to see you guys in person sometime soon.
Yes, lovely. Should we take like a picture or something of all of us?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, yes, I would love that. Would you guys want to come closer to this camera? Sakina, you can join me.
Join Tanvi
PR
and
and
two
me
of us
knows.
can be once you talk.
The
That got
lights are
very
too
bright very
bright.
quickly. Yeah, the neurodivergent in me got spooked very quickly because of that.
Yeah, my eyes
Okay, once
are.
everyone's ready, let me know. I'll take. Okay, one. Okay, set, all
Yeah.
set, all
It's
outfits,
like
hair,
somebody
everyone's.
walked. Okay, it's
Okay, who are we
symbolic,
giving the
I
center
guess.
stage to? Okay, lovely. Okay, that's spooky, but okay. Ah, damn.
We're ready.
Okay, smile. One, two, three. Lovely.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We had a
Thank
great
you.
time, and thank
Same
you so
here.
much again for joining.